Have you ever felt like you're living someone else's life? Going through the motions, hiding parts of yourself because it feels safer? I've been there. Jackson, a guy just like any of us, spent years building a life based on expectations until one night, everything changed. What happens when you stop pretending and start living authentically? Let me take you on a journey of self-discovery, of finding the courage to embrace who you really are. Stay with me. This story could be the push you need to start living for yourself, not anyone else. Jackson's life seemed perfect. Or at least, that's how it looked to the outside world. He was an investment banker in one of the most prestigious firms, making deals that could change the financial landscape of entire industries. His resume was impeccable, and his colleagues respected him. At 35, he had everything society told him to want: a high-paying job, a beautiful home, a stable relationship with Samantha, his longtime friend turned occasional partner, and a life that appeared to be neatly organized and secure. But when you looked a little closer, you could see the cracks. They weren't always visible to everyone, sometimes not even to Jackson himself, but they were there, like small fissures in a perfect surface, waiting for the right moment to show themselves. His day began early, usually before the sun had risen. Jackson's morning routine was meticulously planned, waking up at exactly 5:30 a.m., a cup of coffee brewed to perfection, and then straight to his workout, just enough to stay fit, but never pushing his limits. He was efficient. He was disciplined. His clothes were always pressed, his meetings precise. The world he inhabited was one of order and control, where every step was calculated and every word was measured. There was little room for spontaneity or for anything that could throw him off balance. It was a life that worked, on paper anyway. But Jackson's life wasn't just about the routine. It was about the image. The image of a man who had everything together. A man who had mastered the art of balancing multiple identities. His professional self, his social self, his familial self, and the one he buried deep inside. The Jackson that existed at work was the one that walked into boardrooms with a perfect smile, a neutral tone, and the kind of flawless composure that made clients trust him with millions of dollars. He had worked hard to build this persona, polished, professional, successful. He had made sure to never let his guard down, not even for a second. Jackson's life outside of work wasn't much different. His relationship with Samantha was comfortable, but there was something in the air, a sense of distance that neither of them ever addressed. They were good friends, best friends even, but when it came to anything deeper, anything more intimate, there was always a barrier between them. She had tried to talk to him about it once, about how he was so distant, so closed off, but he'd always brushed it off, saying it was just his way of managing the stress of his job. Samantha wanted more, wanted to get closer, to share a part of his life that he kept locked away. But Jackson always deflected. He told himself that his life was fine just the way it was. He didn't need anything more. He didn't need to explore his true desires or question his identity. He didn't have time for that. After all, what was there to question? He was successful, wasn't he? He had earned his place in the world, and that was enough, right? But even though Jackson had everything that the world said was important, he felt this gnawing emptiness inside. It wasn't something he could easily put into words, but he could feel it every time he looked at himself in the mirror. Every time he sat down at the kitchen table with Samantha, chatting about the day, but feeling like there was 1,000 things left unsaid between them. Every time he attended a meeting and laughed along with colleagues at jokes that didn't really land, and it all felt so shallow, so controlled. And yet, he kept pushing it aside, because this was what he had been taught to do. This was the life that had been mapped out for him. And Jackson? Well, Jackson followed the script. Just like everyone else. But even a perfect life, built on the expectations of others, starts to wear on you after a while. Jackson had learned to suppress his feelings, to hide his true self behind a well-maintained facade. It wasn't that he didn't care about the people in his life. He did. He loved Samantha, even if he couldn't bring himself to show it. He cared about his colleagues, even if he couldn't let them see the vulnerability he kept buried. But the truth was, Jackson's life wasn't really his own. He was living a story that wasn't written by him, but by society's expectations, by his parents, by the people he interacted with every day. And slowly, he was starting to realize that it's easy to get caught up in the world that everyone else is living in. The world that tells you who you should be, how you should act, and what success looks like. For Jackson, that meant being the perfect banker, the perfect friend, the perfect son. But deep down, he knew it wasn't enough. He was living a life that was incomplete, and he could feel it, even though he was too afraid to confront it. As the days passed, Jackson found himself yearning for something more. He started noticing the cracks a little more. The perfect routine that had once given him comfort now felt suffocating. The smiles he gave his clients began to feel hollow. And the routine he had so carefully constructed, the walls he had built around his true self, began to feel like chains. Chains that bound him to a life that wasn't fulfilling. A life that was nothing more than a series of well-rehearsed roles. One evening, after a particularly draining day at the office, Jackson found himself standing outside a small club in the northern part of the city. It was a place he'd never been before, and he didn't know what drew him to it. Maybe it was the promise of anonymity, or maybe it was just the need for something different. Whatever it was, Jackson pushed open the door and stepped inside. The club was dimly lit, with blue and purple lights casting a soft glow over the people inside. The music was loud, the kind of thumping beat that made it impossible to think too much, which for Jackson was exactly what he needed. He was tired of thinking. Tired of analyzing everything, from his career to his relationships, tired of pretending. He made his way to the bar, ordering a drink and then taking a seat, trying to let go of the weight of the world that always seemed to follow him around. The crowd was different here, free, unapologetic, in a way Jackson wasn't used to. It was a contrast to the polished world he lived in, and somehow it felt both strange and freeing. He couldn't help but notice the feeling of curiosity building in his chest. And then, that's when he saw him. The man was sitting at the other end of the bar, casually sipping a drink, his gaze occasionally drifting in Jackson's direction. It wasn't the kind of look that made Jackson feel uncomfortable. It wasn't invasive or judgmental. It was just curious, almost amused. It caught Jackson off guard, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was playing a role. He didn't feel like he was pretending. Jackson looked away, taking a sip of his own drink, then glanced back. The man was still looking at him, this time with a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. Something about that smile felt different. It was like the man was seeing him, really seeing him, and Jackson felt an odd stir of emotion in his chest. He didn't know why, but for the first time in a long time he felt noticed for who he really was, not the version he showed to everyone else. It was then that the man stood up and casually crossed the bar, taking the empty seat beside Jackson. "You look like you don't belong here," he said, his voice calm and confident, "but I can tell you're exactly where you need to be." Jackson's heart skipped a beat. He had never expected someone to say something like that to him. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words got stuck in his throat. For a brief moment, he didn't know how to react. The man smiled again. "I'm Christopher," he said, extending a hand. In that moment, Jackson didn't feel like the banker, or the son, or the perfect friend. He felt like Jackson. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. But what he didn't know was that meeting Christopher was going to change everything. It was going to be the beginning of something Jackson wasn't prepared for. The beginning of a journey into self-discovery, authenticity, and, most of all, freedom. And as much as Jackson tried to fight it, he was starting to realize that this was the moment that would lead him to the truth about who he really was. The question was he ready to face it? Jackson didn't think his life would change on an evening like this. He hadn't planned on going to the club, and in fact, he'd never thought he'd end up in a place like this. Jackson's life had always had a plan, a clear set of rules. He was an investment banker, a job that required absolute precision, a strictness that couldn't be compromised. His life was built on numbers, smart decisions, long-term contracts, a formula for success that he'd lived by for more than a decade. But the walls around him were starting to crack. For the first time in years, Jackson went to a club without a plan, simply to escape the tension, the world he had built around himself. And that's when he met Christopher. When Jackson entered the club, nothing stood out. The crowd was still chatting, the music was loud, and the blue and purple lights made the atmosphere mysterious. But there was something that made him feel strange. Not the noise, not the people around him, but the silence in his soul, as if everything was waiting for a change. As Jackson walked into the bar, a different feeling washed over him. He couldn't stop thinking about work, about tomorrow's meetings, about the numbers he had to crunch. He just wanted to relax, to shake off the tension that wouldn't leave his mind. And then he saw him. A man sat at the other end of the bar, his gaze seemingly following Jackson. But it wasn't a curious or judging look. It was a penetrating look, as if the man was searching for something truly within Jackson. He didn't flinch, just looked back gently, not hurriedly, not pressing. Just a look, but enough to make Jackson feel different. Jackson couldn't explain the feeling. He couldn't understand why there was someone who could make him feel so strange just by looking at him. He awkwardly turned away, holding the glass of wine in his hand, then looked back. The man was still looking at him, and this time he smiled. Not a mocking smile, but a pleasant smile, as if he recognized something in Jackson that Jackson himself had never recognized. Neither of them needed to say anything. That look was enough. And then the man stood up, walked through the crowd, and walked towards Jackson. Every step he took seemed to expand the space around him, and Jackson couldn't help but look. For some reason, he felt a strange connection, a desire to open up, to step outside the shell he had kept himself in for so many years. As he approached and sat down next to Jackson, he smiled again, as if he had been waiting for him. "It seems like you don't belong here," the man said softly, "but I can sense that you really need to be here." Jackson was shocked. He didn't know what to say. He didn't think a stranger could see through him like that. But there was something about those words that made Jackson feel comfortable. Like he had found a part of Jackson that Jackson himself had never understood. For the first time in years, he didn't have to pretend, didn't have to hide. "Yeah," Jackson replied, trying to calm himself. "I just came here to relax a little." The man smiled slightly, not a sarcastic smile, but an easy smile, as if he saw something Jackson didn't. "You don't have to pretend," he said. "I see it. You don't belong here, not the way you live, but I think you need some breathing room." Jackson turned to look at him, confused. "Who are you?" he asked, curious. "Christopher Jackson," he replied, shaking Christopher's hand. The feeling of the handshake was strange, as if it had a deeper meaning that he could not understand. And strangely, a strange sense of peace enveloped Jackson. His whole life had been full of calculations, relationships that were only to maintain an image. But here, with Christopher, he felt like he could relax, like he could be himself. Christopher continued, "I guess you're not a regular here. But I was once like you. We all live in a box, don't we? A box we create ourselves." Jackson felt as if every word Christopher said penetrated his heart. He couldn't understand how someone he had just met could understand him so well. From the gentle words that seemed to point out the truth that Jackson had tried to hide for so long, to the gentle but profound advice. "Box?" Jackson asked again, still a little confused. "What do you mean?" Christopher smiled, his eyes calm. "Think about your life. You try to do everything in a certain way, don't you? Work, family, friends, it's all in a box you created for yourself. But what's inside? Are you trapped in that box?" Christopher's words seemed to tear apart the fabric around Jackson. He had never thought of his life this way. They continued to talk, from small things about hobbies to deeper questions about human nature, about dreams that Jackson had long forgotten. More than just a chance encounter, Jackson felt as if his life was opening up in a whole new way. The freedom that Christopher brought was something Jackson had never dreamed of. Everything before his eyes began to change. Christopher didn't force, didn't rush. Just empathy and sincerity, making Jackson feel like he wasn't alone in this journey anymore. A small step, a gradual change. But it was what Jackson needed. A change he never dared to think about. The night after his encounter with Christopher, Jackson woke up with a strange feeling in his stomach. He didn't know what to call it, but it was different from anything he had ever felt before. In fact, it was more like an awakening. Something had begun to move inside him that he had never realized before. For a long time, Jackson had lived the life of someone else, someone he felt he had to be to meet the expectations of those around him. But that night, while talking to Christopher, something inside him began to break down the walls he had built up over the years. He remembered Christopher's eyes so clearly. They didn't just look at Jackson. They seemed to look through him, at the parts of him that Jackson had tried to bury, the parts of him that he had always tried to hide from the world. They were rough, unfinished, but also the most genuine parts of him. For the first time, he felt like someone saw him for who he was, without judgment, without expecting him to be someone else. It was something Jackson had never experienced before. Throughout the following week, thoughts of his conversation with Christopher kept swirling in Jackson's mind. He couldn't shake the feeling of freedom Christopher had mentioned. He wondered, do I dare to step out of this safe and comfortable shell? Do I have the courage to live my true life? And those questions kept swirling in his mind. In the days that followed at the company, Jackson felt strangely familiar with himself. He began to see things that he had always done as a habit, a natural reflex, but now became blurred. He looked at the computer screen, at the numbers he was comparing, but suddenly felt like he was living in a blurred world where everything was just a formality. He was tired, not because the work was hard, but because he could no longer find meaning in it. He no longer felt like he was in control, but like a shadow chasing after what others wanted. That day, as Jackson sat at his desk, a call came from his mother. Her voice on the phone was gentle, but filled with hesitant questions about his life. They had a brief conversation, talking about the usual things: work, the weather, a few questions about his health. But when the call ended, Jackson felt a lump in his throat. How could he answer her about the important things in his life that he had never dared to admit to himself? He recalled conversations with his best friend Samantha, who had always told him that his life was too tight, too closed. She said that Jackson needed to live more, to try new things, to expand his world. But Jackson had always told her that everything was fine. He had built a perfect life. He didn't need anything more. But now, after meeting Christopher, after his words about freedom within himself, Jackson began to see the limits he had placed on himself. One evening, Jackson decided to go for a walk. He had no specific purpose. He just needed to get out of the four walls he had lived in all this time. The vague sense of freedom, of discovery that lurked within him grew stronger. He walked through the quiet streets of Chicago, looking into the lit windows, thinking about the lives he had never lived, the opportunities he had missed out on because of fear. A part of him, a stronger part, was beginning to realize that he could change. He could step out of the shadow of the false perfection he had created for himself. He didn't have to continue living the way others expected him to. He didn't have to continue playing a character he wasn't. But at the same time, the fear was still there, like a shadow that followed his every move. The more he traveled and thought, the more Jackson realized that those fears, no matter how great, were only temporary. Yes, he might lose some things. He might have difficulty changing. But what he would find on the other side of the change would likely be a life he never dared to imagine. A life where he would be himself, not the version of himself that everyone wanted him to be. The next day, he called Christopher. "Do you have time?" Jackson asked, his voice no longer doubtful. He didn't know exactly what he wanted, but a sense of change was guiding him. "Always be ready, Jackson. We can meet any time," Christopher replied. His voice was soft, comforting. "I know you're dealing with a lot, but trust me, you'll get through it." And that was when Jackson decided, for the first time in his life, to live in a way he had never lived before. He began to search for the truth about himself. Not the truth that others wanted him to live, but the truth that he felt inside. He decided to no longer live according to society's plans. No longer live in the mold that others had forced upon him. He would live his life, a life that was full, honest, and fearless. That day, Jackson sat with Christopher in a small coffee shop in the city. They didn't say much, but the few words they exchanged carried a lot of weight. Christopher shared with him his own journey, his stumbles, and the courageous steps he took when he decided to be true to himself. Christopher's story was an example, an inspiration, making Jackson understand that he could do the same. To live without fear, to love and accept himself. During the conversation, Jackson realized that he used to be afraid of change, afraid of rejection, afraid of losing everything he had built. But now, he understood that all those things, the things he thought were important, were actually just fleeting things. The most important thing was that he could live for himself. After that conversation, Jackson felt like a new person. He didn't have to change everything right away, but he began to accept himself more. He began to understand that change wasn't something to be afraid of. It was part of growing up, of finding yourself. And for the first time, Jackson felt free. No more fake relationships, no more burdens of expectations from family, friends, or work. He could be himself. But like any journey of self-discovery, it wasn't always easy. The fear was still there, Sometimes a small worry, sometimes a nagging sense of what he might lose. But now Jackson had the confidence to face it. He began to change, to make small but important decisions. He began to express himself more, not only to Christopher, but also to Samantha, to other friends, and even to people at work. He realized that, although he might lose some things, what he would gain in return was his real life. Jackson woke up one morning with a strange feeling he had never had before. He couldn't pinpoint exactly what made him feel different, but there was definitely a big change happening inside him. He looked out the window, saw the morning light shining on the city, but inside him, things were no longer the same. A part of him was awake, and it wasn't an easy part to face. A few weeks ago, he was still dreaming in fake relationships, wearing the mask of expectations from family, work, and society. His life was a narrow box full of expectations that he thought he had to meet. He worked hard, had dinners with friends, went jogging on weekend mornings, but it all felt vague and meaningless. He couldn't recognize who he was in the midst of it all. And then, after meeting Christopher, a fire started to burn inside him. Jackson was no longer the man he had been. He was no longer living in the molds others had created for him. He was no longer living to please others, to maintain a perfect image without an inner truth. He began to realize that freedom was not something that could be achieved immediately, not a spontaneous act. True freedom was a long process, a series of small but consistent steps in the journey of self-discovery. But that feeling, the feeling that he could be himself, was not a simple thing. There were days when Jackson still felt afraid. Afraid of not knowing how to face his loved ones. Afraid of what would happen if he decided to live differently. But gradually he realized that freedom was not the absence of fear, but the courage to face it, to accept himself in all aspects. One afternoon, Jackson sat in his apartment, listening to the wind blowing through the window. He thought about what he had been through in the past few months. Every decision he made, every small step he took, led him to a change he could not have imagined. And it all started with accepting himself, with daring to be true to himself, without hiding or pretending. But the journey hasn't always been easy. Jackson still feels a little nervous about the conversations he'll have with his family, especially his mother. He doesn't know what to say to her, how to explain this change. His mother always expected him to be successful, to be perfect, to be a role model in society. But now, Jackson doesn't want to live up to those expectations anymore. He wants to live for himself, to live a real life. And then, one day, when he called his mother, he knew he couldn't keep running away anymore. He couldn't live in the darkness of the lies he'd created. His mother answered, her voice soft but a little worried. "How are you, Jackson? You've been working a lot lately, haven't you?" his mother asked, a reminder of his responsibilities. Jackson felt a wave of pain rise in his chest. "Mom, I'm fine," he said, trying to keep his voice calm, but inside he was in turmoil. He wanted to say more, to explain that he no longer wanted to live up to her expectations, that he needed to find his own path. But how could he begin such a conversation when he had never really shared how he felt in his life? The call ended quickly, and Jackson felt the loneliness wash over him again. But this time, it was different. He no longer felt alone in his life. He realized that what mattered most was the truth about himself, not the expectations he had carried with him for so many years. The journey to freedom was not an easy one. Jackson still faced questions, uncertain feelings about change, and moments of fear when facing the unknown. But the small steps he took gradually created big changes in his life. He began to change the way he viewed work, relationships, and especially himself. Although it wasn't easy, Jackson began to learn how to face the people around him without feeling like he had to wear a mask. He became more straightforward, being true to his feelings without fear of being judged. Conversations with friends became deeper, no longer superficial. Everything seemed to take on a new meaning, a new vitality. And then, one evening, while sitting with Christopher, Jackson realized that he had changed. He was no longer a man trying to be someone he was not. He was no longer living in the shadow of societal or family expectations. He was himself, and that was true freedom. Christopher smiled at him, without saying anything. Just a look, a gentle squeeze of his hand. And in that moment, Jackson understood that there was no need for a happy ending, no need for a perfect ending. This life was his, and he had the right to create it the way he wanted. There were no distinctions, no expectations, just the wonderful freedom of being true to himself. "Life will never be perfect, Jackson," Christopher said softly, "but it will be meaningful when you live as your true self." Jackson did not answer right away. He just smiled and felt the freedom welling up inside him. He finally understood that freedom was not the absence of fear, but the courage to face fear, the courage to step outside the limits that he had set for himself. And so, another step is taken in the journey to true freedom, not something grand or flashy, but a small yet profound change, a decision to live for oneself. There was a feeling Jackson had never felt before, freedom in every breath, in every step, in every decision he made. He was no longer the man he had been. After the conversations with Christopher, the moments when he decided to open up and accept himself, Jackson felt like he had emerged from a cocoon, ready to step out into the world with a new identity. Every day, when he woke up, everything around him seemed to have a different light. His outlook on work, on family, on relationships in his life was no longer the same. Everything, although not perfect, had a new vitality. Jackson was no longer afraid of change. He was no longer afraid to face the truth, even if it was a truth he had tried to avoid for many years. So, after years of trying to live up to the expectations of his family, friends, and society, Jackson finally understood that his life was not what others expected of him, but what he chose for himself. He understood that every decision, no matter how small or big, could open new doors. That was when he realized that true freedom is not the absence of barriers, but the ability to face and overcome those barriers to be true to himself. It might not happen right away. It might be a long and challenging journey. But Jackson clearly felt like he was entering a new chapter in his life. No more sleepless nights of fear. No more fake conversations to maintain an image he thought he had to have. He was starting to live authentically, and that was a profound change. It wasn't always easy, though. Every morning when Jackson walked into the office, he still felt a little nervous. The looks from his coworkers, the conversations with clients, it all made him feel like he was facing a world he hadn't fully accepted. But instead of feeling pressured, Jackson began to see things differently. He stopped worrying about being judged. He began to feel that if people really cared about him, they would understand that he was just living his life the way he felt was right. And if they didn't, that was okay too. One of the first steps Jackson took was to share the truth about himself with Samantha, his longtime friend whom he had always considered his best friend. She was the only person in his life he could fully trust, but he had also kept his true thoughts and feelings from her for too long. He didn't want to disappoint her, didn't want her to feel like he had been living a lie. One evening, as they sat together at the coffee shop they frequented, Jackson felt a strange tension. It was time for him to open up, to say what he had kept hidden for so long. Samantha looked at him, her eyes filled with concern. "Jackson, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. Jackson took a deep breath. Samantha, there's something I've never really shared with you. I've lived for years without knowing what I really wanted. I've lived according to what people expected of me, what society told me I should do, and I realized I can't do that anymore. Samantha looked at him silently, but there was no judgment in her eyes. Instead, there was understanding. She gently took his hand, as if to say that everything would be okay. I understand, she said, her voice warm. I always knew there was something you weren't ready to share. But you know, I just want you to be happy. You don't have to live for what others want. Just live for yourself. Samantha's words were gentle, yet profound, and Jackson felt like he had released a part of himself. He didn't have to hide anymore. He could be true to himself, knowing that there would always be people willing to understand and love him for who he really was. Not long after, Jackson also decided to tell his mother about this change. This was a conversation he had been hesitant to have for a long time, because he knew that his mother would not easily accept these changes. But then he realized that if he did not tell her, he would not be able to continue living as himself. The call with his mother started as usual. His mother asked about work, about his health, but Jackson knew he couldn't keep avoiding it. Mom, I have something to tell you, Jackson began, his voice trembling but determined. I can't live like this anymore. I can't live a life that isn't mine. His mother was silent for a moment, but then she spoke. Jackson, you've always been a good boy. You work hard, you have a good job, a good family. But you know, you need to live for yourself. You need to know who you really are, and you deserve to be happy. His mother's words made Jackson feel a sense of liberation. He thought his mother wouldn't understand, but she was the first person to accept his change. Her words were like an affirmation that he didn't have to change to please anyone, but to live true to himself. Life isn't always easy, but Jackson is no longer afraid. Every day he faces new challenges, but now they are no longer scary. He knows that true freedom comes from being true to yourself, from accepting and loving yourself, no matter how difficult it may be. One day, as Jackson stood on the balcony of his apartment, looking out over the city of Chicago, he felt a change within him. The streets, the tall buildings, all seemed to look at him in a different light. He was no longer the man he thought he was supposed to be. He was himself. And that was a wonderful thing. Jackson knows that his journey is still long. He will face challenges. There will be times when he feels insecure. But he also knows that as long as he is true to himself, he will find true peace and freedom. Things will not be perfect, but at least he will no longer have to live a lie. And that's a new beginning. Jackson's life changed, but it didn't happen in one moment. It happened gradually, with small but courageous steps. You may be wondering, is it possible for you to change in your own life? Can you break out of the boxes that society, your family, or yourself have created for you to live a truly free, truly your own life? If there is one thing Jackson has learned in his journey, it is that freedom is not a destination, but a continuous process. It is a journey to find the truth about yourself and to be true to yourself. Not to please anyone, not to meet society's expectations, but to find true peace and happiness within your own soul. Surely you have had those moments when you looked in the mirror and asked yourself, is this me? Those moments, sometimes, are like a flash in the middle of a busy life, where you realize you've been living your whole life without really living. Maybe you've been hiding the most important parts of yourself, the parts that you're afraid others will see. But what if you decided to open up those parts? What if you could live with all the unexpressed parts, the desires, the dreams, and the fears that you've never dared to face? We often think of change as a big event, a painful fall, or a life-altering decision. But in reality, change often comes from the smallest of steps. A heartfelt conversation with a friend, a decision to stand up and speak your truth, a moment when you realize that your life is not written by someone else, but by you. Big changes start with small decisions, and sometimes it is those small changes that bring about the most profound transformations in life. For Jackson, the first step was admitting to himself that he couldn't live in the box he'd been trapped in for so many years. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay when he was actually lost in his own life. And when he decided to open up, when he decided to be honest with his feelings and desires, a new door opened. A door that not only led to more honest relationships, but also helped him find a freedom he never thought possible. Jackson's story is not just the story of a man finding freedom in his personal life. It is the story of any of us who have ever felt tired of the roles we play, of the stereotypes that society sets for us. It is the story of anyone who has ever dreamed of living a life without fear, without pretense. You could be Jackson, or you could be someone listening to this story and realizing that you are in the midst of a similar journey. And importantly, you are not alone. Maybe you're at a crossroads right now, feeling lost and unsure of where to go. Maybe you're afraid because you don't know what you'll lose by making a change, by stepping out of your comfort zone. But that fear is a sign that something big is about to happen. When you're afraid, you're on the brink of change. And change, no matter how difficult, is an opportunity for you to find yourself. If you're feeling uncertain about the path ahead, remember that every step, no matter how small, counts. Big changes don't happen overnight, but every action, every decision you make to be true to yourself, will gradually lead you to the life you truly want. Not everyone around you may understand right away, but that's not the point. What matters is that you understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. When you live for yourself, your life becomes meaningful and fulfilling. The freedom Jackson found was not a miracle, nor was it something that could be found through some external search. True freedom comes from within, from facing your fears, from accepting every part of yourself, good and bad, imperfect and imperfect. When you can be true to yourself, you will find that there is nothing to fear. You will no longer be bound by the expectations of others, no longer be governed by what others think of you. And most importantly, when you are true to yourself, you will never have to pretend again. You will not have to worry about pleasing anyone. You will find peace in every step you take, in every decision you make. And that is true freedom. Freedom that is not the absence of all the difficulties in life, but the ability to face and overcome those difficulties, knowing that you are living the life you truly want. So if you're feeling insecure, if you're feeling uncertain about your path, remember that it's just part of the journey. Take it slow and steady. Allow yourself to have moments of uncertainty, but never stop moving forward. You deserve to live a real life, a life where you don't have to hide from anyone, where you don't have to hide from yourself. Finally, remember that life is not always perfect, and things do not always go the way you want them to. But the important thing is that you are being true to yourself. You are finding happiness in the smallest things, in daring to face yourself and love yourself. Freedom is not a destination, it's a journey. And this journey begins when you decide to be true to yourself.